It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the small suburban town of Glenview. The sun was bright, the streets were calm, and for Greg Matthews, life had settled into a rhythm. Greg was a 45-year-old man who had spent the last 5 years building a life with his wife, Maria, and her son, Tommy. When Greg first married Maria, he knew it would be a challenge to step into the role of a father to a young man who was already in his late teens. Tommy was 17 when Greg met him, and their relationship had always been a little awkward at first. But over the years, Greg had tried to do his best, offering guidance, support, and the kind of fatherly advice that any young man might need. Tommy was a smart kid, but he'd always been a little closed off, and Greg didn't push him too hard. He believed that their bond would grow over time, like any father-son relationship does. But lately, Tommy had grown distant. His once vibrant personality had dulled, and he seemed to prefer spending time alone or out with his friends. Greg wasn't sure what was going on, but he attributed it to the natural process of growing up. Maybe Tommy was just starting to find his own way in life, separate from his family. That afternoon, Greg was finishing up a project at work, and as he glanced at the clock, he realized it was earlier than usual. With the office quiet and his task list completed for the day, Greg decided to head home. He hadn't planned on doing anything special, perhaps it was just one of those days when he felt the urge to break the monotony. He figured he would grab a quick bite to eat, check in with Maria, and spend a little time with Tommy before he headed to his late shift at the factory. As Greg walked in the front door, the house was eerily quiet. Maria was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she always did. She was in her late 40s, a warm-hearted woman with an ever-present smile, though Greg had noticed a certain strain in her lately. Their once passionate connection seemed to have faded with time. But he didn't dwell on it. They were still a team, and that was what mattered. "Hey, babe," Greg greeted her, stepping into the kitchen. Maria looked up, offering a small smile, her eyes not quite meeting his. There was a quiet tension between them that neither of them spoke about. Greg chalked it up to stress, work, Tommy, life in general. He didn't think too much of it. "Hey, how was your day?" Maria replied, her voice soft but distant. Greg's thoughts wandered for a moment. He'd noticed this distance for a while now. She wasn't as engaged with him as she used to be, but he never pushed the subject. He didn't want to add pressure to her already full plate. Tommy's absence didn't go unnoticed either. He wasn't in the living room, playing video games or lounging around like he usually did. Greg wondered if Tommy had gone out with his friends, but as the minutes passed, Greg began to feel a small knot in his stomach. It wasn't like Tommy to stay out without saying anything. After a few minutes, Greg decided to check on him. He walked down the hallway toward Tommy's room. The door was ajar, and inside, the room appeared exactly as it always had, organized, yet with hints of disarray. Tommy was sitting on the bed, his phone in his hand. He didn't hear Greg enter, and for a brief moment, Greg considered stepping back. There was something in the air, a sense that something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Greg stood there for a moment, watching Tommy in silence. He was looking at his phone, his face illuminated by the screen, eyes focused and intense. Greg wasn't the type to snoop, but something about the situation felt wrong. He hesitated. "Tommy?" Greg said softly, causing Tommy to look up in surprise. Tommy quickly put the phone down, his face reddening slightly. "Oh, hey, Dad. Didn't hear you come in." Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden beneath the surface. Tommy was always respectful, but this sudden defensiveness was unusual. Greg ignored the moment of awkwardness and tried to make light of it. "Everything okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You seem a little distracted." Tommy shrugged, his expression stiff. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just, stuff. Work stuff." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Work stuff?" Since when do you have work stuff? He chuckled, trying to make it sound casual, but Tommy didn't laugh back. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Greg's gaze. I'm fine, Tommy muttered, quickly standing up. Just need to finish something, I'll be downstairs in a minute. Greg didn't press him further. He'd seen Tommy pull away before, and he assumed it was just a phase. Maybe Tommy was dealing with the usual challenges of being a young adult. Still, Greg couldn't shake the strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. As he turned to leave, Greg glanced over at the desk in the corner of the room. There, lying on top of a pile of books, was Tommy's phone, left forgotten. Normally, Greg would never invade his privacy, but for some reason, he felt compelled to take a quick look. He knew it was wrong, but the curiosity gnawed at him. He picked up the phone, and his finger hovered over the screen. Without thinking, he unlocked it using Tommy's simple passcode. It only took a moment to bring up the messages, and what Greg saw there made his heart skip a beat. The first message was from an unknown number. I can't wait to see you tonight. Let's make sure nobody finds out. It was casual, but the words were clear, an affair. The second message was even more direct. Are we still on for tomorrow? I'll tell Maria I'm going to the store. She won't suspect a thing. Greg's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. It couldn't be. His stepson, his own flesh and blood, was having an affair. And with someone in their inner circle, no less. The shock of it hit Greg like a ton of bricks. Who was this person? Who was Tommy seeing behind their backs? Why hadn't he confided in Greg? Hadn't they built a relationship where Tommy could trust him? All these questions swirled in Greg's mind, but one thing was certain, his family's world had just been shattered. The quiet afternoon had turned into a storm he never saw coming. Greg's hands trembled as he put the phone down. He had to know more. He had to confront Tommy, but the fear of what he might discover next paralyzed him. The phone was a portal to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Taking a deep breath, Greg made a decision. He would confront Tommy later. Not right away, but soon. This was too big to ignore, too important to let slide. There was no going back. The life he thought he knew, his marriage, his family, was on the brink of collapse. And it was all because of a secret that had been hiding in plain sight. Greg could only hope that whatever happened next, it would be something he could survive. That night, Greg lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Tommy's phone screen, the messages that seemed so out of place in the life he thought he knew. The words kept echoing in his head, I can't wait to see you tonight. Let's make sure nobody finds out. Who could this person be? What kind of relationship had Tommy been hiding from him? More importantly, why hadn't he confided in Greg? Greg's mind replayed every interaction he had ever had with Tommy. He thought about the times they'd shared, the moments where Greg tried to be there for him, offering advice, support, and guidance. Had those moments meant nothing? Was this betrayal something that had been brewing for a while, or was it a recent development? Greg didn't know how to answer those questions, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He felt both angry and deeply hurt, but mostly, he felt betrayed. Tommy had been his stepson for 5 years, and this felt like a gut punch. Maria, lying beside him, stirred in her sleep. Greg glanced at her, but he couldn't bring himself to talk to her about it. He knew that confronting Tommy would only raise more questions, and Maria didn't need that kind of stress. But what if this secret affected her too? Greg couldn't shake the nagging thought that Tommy's affair, whatever it was, could be just the tip of the iceberg. What else had he been hiding? The distance between Greg and Maria had grown in recent months, but this? This felt like the final blow. By the time morning came, Greg had barely slept. He forced himself to get up and get ready for work, the usual routine feeling hollow and distant. He went through the motions, shower, breakfast, coffee, but his mind was on the phone, on Tommy's secret, and on the confrontation that was waiting to happen. When he arrived home from work that evening, the house was quiet. He knew Maria was in the kitchen, but he couldn't bring himself to engage with her just yet. The weight of what he had discovered was too much to bear. He needed answers, but he didn't know how to ask the questions. Greg stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at Tommy's closed bedroom door. His hand hovered over the knob, but he hesitated. Part of him feared what he might hear, what Tommy might say, or worse, what he might not say. Finally, Greg knocked on the door, his knuckles tapping lightly against the wood. There was no response. He knocked again, louder this time, and still nothing. He opened the door slightly, but the room was empty. Tommy's bed was made, his books neatly stacked on the desk, and the faint smell of cologne lingered in the air. Tommy wasn't home. Greg let out a sigh of relief, but it was brief. He was angry, but he was also scared. He walked downstairs, his mind still whirling. He needed to confront Tommy, but not like this. Not in a way that would force the truth out in a rush. He needed to understand why Tommy had kept this secret for so long, why he hadn't trusted Greg enough to tell him. But as the evening passed and Tommy didn't come home, Greg's fear grew. He began to wonder if Tommy even realized the gravity of the situation he had created. That night, Greg couldn't sleep again. The same thoughts haunted him, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the messages on the phone. His heart pounded in his chest, and the more he thought about it, the more his emotions tangled into a confusing mix of rage and sorrow. He had no idea who Tommy was seeing, but he knew it wasn't just some fling. The secrecy, the hidden messages, it all pointed to something deeper, something that went beyond the ordinary teenage rebellion he had expected from his stepson. Tommy's actions didn't fit the mold of what Greg had believed him to be. The next morning, Greg went through his usual routine, but everything felt different. The weight of the previous night's revelations hung over him like a storm cloud. He barely spoke to Maria at breakfast, though she noticed his distant behavior. "Greg, what's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Greg hesitated, unsure if he should confide in her. She hadn't been herself lately, and their relationship felt fragile. But in that moment, Greg knew he couldn't keep this secret to himself any longer. "I found something last night," he said, his voice low. Maria's eyes widened, and she set down her coffee cup, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice shaky. Greg took a deep breath and told her everything. He explained how he had found Tommy's phone, how he had unlocked it and read the messages that hinted at an affair. Maria listened silently, her expression unreadable. When Greg finished, she sat back in her chair, her face pale. "This can't be true," Maria whispered. "Tommy, no, he wouldn't," her voice trailed off as she struggled to process the information. Greg reached out and took her hand, but he couldn't offer her the comfort she was searching for. "What are we supposed to do now?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. Greg didn't have an answer. He wanted to confront Tommy, but he wasn't sure where to begin. He had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went or what kind of relationship Tommy had been hiding. The thought of confronting him made Greg's stomach churn, but he couldn't let it go. They needed answers. They needed to know the truth. As the day went on, Greg tried to focus on work, but the unease never left him. Every time he checked his phone, he found himself hoping for a message from Tommy, a sign that everything was okay. But there was nothing. Tommy hadn't reached out, and Greg knew that meant something. By evening, Tommy still hadn't returned home. Greg's concern turned to anger. How could Tommy be so careless, so reckless? Was this affair just the beginning? Greg couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he knew. Tommy had always been a good kid, a little rebellious at times, but Greg never imagined something like this lurking beneath the surface. When Tommy finally came home, it was late. Greg was waiting in the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. Tommy looked surprised to see him, and for a moment, there was a strange tension in the air. Tommy opened his mouth to speak, but Greg cut him off. "Where have you been?" Greg demanded, his voice harsh. Tommy flinched, but he didn't say anything at first. Finally, he spoke. "I was just hanging out with some friends." Greg didn't buy it. "Don't lie to me, Tommy. I know what you've been doing." Tommy's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. He didn't know what to say. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. Greg could see the guilt written all over his stepson's face, and the realization hit him hard. Tommy had been hiding something, and now it was time to face the truth. "I know about the messages," Greg said quietly, his voice steady but filled with hurt. Tommy froze. His entire body tensed, and for a brief moment, Greg thought he might collapse. But instead, Tommy took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I didn't mean for it to get this far, Greg. I never meant for anyone to find out." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Greg's heart broke as he listened to his stepson's confession, and he knew this moment would mark the beginning of something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. Tommy wasn't just hiding an affair, he was hiding a part of himself. And now, the truth was finally coming to light. Tommy's confession hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, neither Greg nor Tommy said anything. The tension between them was palpable, like a storm just waiting to break. Greg tried to process what he had just heard, but his emotions were a whirlwind: shock, hurt, anger, confusion. How had it come to this? How had the boy he'd raised, the stepson he thought he understood, ended up in a situation so far from what he had imagined? Tommy's words echoed in Greg's mind: "I didn't mean for it to get this far, Greg. I never meant for anyone to find out." Greg wanted to shout, to demand more answers, but instead, he stayed silent, forcing himself to stay calm. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, Tommy? How did it get this far?" Tommy's eyes darted nervously around the room, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. He looked like a kid caught in a lie, but there was something deeper in his expression, a fear, a shame, a vulnerability. It was clear this wasn't just about a simple mistake. Something had gone terribly wrong, and Tommy had allowed it to spiral out of control. I don't know," Tommy said, his voice cracking slightly. "It just happened. One thing led to another. I didn't mean for it to turn into this. I thought I could control it, but I couldn't." Greg's heart twisted as he listened. Tommy had been a good kid, or so Greg had thought. He had always been a bit of a rebel, the kind of teenager who pushed boundaries, but this? This was something entirely different. The betrayal wasn't just in the affair, it was in the fact that Tommy had kept this secret, had hidden it from Greg and Maria. The boy Greg had come to see as his son had been living a double life, and Greg didn't know how to handle that. "You're going to have to explain more than that, Tommy," Greg said, his voice firmer now. "Who is this person? What exactly is going on here?" Tommy hesitated, glancing down at his shoes as if he were ashamed to look Greg in the eye. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "Her name is Emily. We met at school. At first, it was just talking. You know, casual stuff. But then it became more. We started hanging out more, and I don't know, things just escalated. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want this to affect you or Mom. But then I realized I was in too deep. And I couldn't get out." Greg's mind raced as he processed the information. Emily. A girl from Tommy's school. Was she the one behind all of this, or was Tommy simply caught up in something bigger than himself? What was going through his son's mind when he made the decision to keep it all a secret? What did Emily mean to him? And why had Tommy hidden her from Greg and Maria? Why didn't you tell us, Tommy? Greg asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hurt and frustration. Why didn't you come to us sooner? Why didn't you trust us enough to talk about it? Tommy ran a hand through his hair, his face filled with guilt. I didn't know how. I didn't want to disappoint you, Greg. You've always been there for me, and I didn't want to mess things up. I thought I could fix it on my own. But I couldn't. It just kept getting worse. Greg shook his head, his mind spinning. The boy he had trusted, the boy he had tried to guide, had been hiding a secret so huge, so painful. And now, the truth was spilling out, but it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like the beginning of a nightmare. You should have come to us, Greg said, his voice low and filled with regret. You don't have to handle things like this on your own. We're a family, Tommy. We're supposed to be there for each other, no matter what. This, whatever this is, it affects all of us. Tommy nodded, his eyes filling with tears. I know, Greg. I'm sorry. I really am. But I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't want to hurt you and Mom. I thought if I kept it hidden, it would go away. But now I know I've messed everything up. Greg let out a deep sigh. He didn't know what to say next. The anger he had been feeling was now mixing with a deep sadness. He thought about how Tommy had grown up in their home, how they had shared so many moments together. Had it all been a lie? Had Tommy been pretending to be someone he wasn't all this time? Greg's mind raced, but one thing was clear, he couldn't fix this on his own. The conversation came to a halt, and for several minutes, there was nothing but silence between them. Tommy's shoulders slumped, and Greg couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had always prided himself on being a good stepfather, someone who could guide Tommy through life's challenges. But this was something far beyond what he had ever expected. Greg thought about Maria. He hadn't told her yet. He hadn't wanted to involve her in this just yet, but the time had come. Maria had to know. She deserved to know. But how could he explain this to her? How could he break the news to his wife, the woman he had promised to protect, when everything felt like it was falling apart? Tommy, Greg said, his voice gentle now, you need to tell your mom. She has to know. Tommy's eyes widened in panic. No, Greg, please. I don't want to hurt her. She'll be so upset. I don't want her to hate me. Greg placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, trying to calm him down. She won't hate you, Tommy. She'll be hurt, yes. But she won't hate you. You have to tell her. She has the right to know the truth, just like I do. Tommy nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Greg. I really am. I never meant for any of this to happen. Greg felt a pang of sorrow for the boy. He wasn't a bad kid. He wasn't. But he had made some serious mistakes, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. Greg could see how torn Tommy was, how much he regretted his actions, but that didn't change what had happened. There was no going back. Go to your room, Tommy, Greg said, his voice firm but not unkind. We'll talk more later. You need to get some rest. Tommy nodded and quickly left the room, leaving Greg alone with his thoughts. Greg sank into the couch, his mind reeling with everything he had just learned. It felt like the world had shifted beneath his feet, like the foundation of his family had cracked. What would this mean for their future? Could they ever go back to the way things were? And what would Maria think? The silence in the house was deafening as Greg sat there, alone with his thoughts. Everything had changed. He had hoped that raising Tommy would be a smooth ride, that they would navigate the challenges together, but this? This was uncharted territory, and Greg didn't know how to move forward. All he knew was that things would never be the same. He glanced at the clock. It was getting late. Tommy was probably already in his room, still processing the conversation they just had. Maria would be home soon, and Greg would have to tell her the truth. He didn't know how to start that conversation, but he knew it was inevitable. The secrets were out, and the fallout was just beginning. Greg took a deep breath and stood up. It was time to face Maria. Time to face whatever came next. Maria arrived home later that evening, her usual smile and easygoing demeanor instantly recognizable. But Greg could see the tension in her eyes, the slight furrow in her brow. She was tired from work, no doubt, but there was something more, something she sensed, something unspoken in the air. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter and gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, but Greg could tell she was waiting for him to speak first. "Greg, you okay?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, as if she could feel the weight of the silence between them. Greg tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He cleared his throat, his hands suddenly feeling clammy. "We need to talk, Maria." Her eyes flickered with concern, and she set down her coat, slowly moving toward him. "What's wrong? What happened?" Her voice was full of concern, and that only made it harder for Greg to find the words. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This wasn't going to be easy. He had never expected that he would have to break this kind of news to her, about Tommy, about the betrayal, about everything. But now, it was time. "It's Tommy," he said, his voice shaky. He's been keeping something from us. Something big." Maria's face immediately turned serious. She walked over to the table, her hands resting on the surface as she looked at Greg, waiting for him to continue. "What do you mean? What's going on with Tommy?" Greg hesitated, feeling a deep sense of guilt pressing down on him. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew he couldn't sugarcoat this. "He's been involved with someone. A girl named Emily. And he's been hiding it from us for months. But it's not just that. There's more to it. He's been lying to us. Keeping secrets from both of us." Maria's expression darkened, her brows furrowing. "Lying? What kind of secrets?" Greg swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "It's an affair, Maria. Tommy has been seeing this girl, and we didn't know. He was hiding it, pretending everything was fine. And now it's all come out. He feels guilty, but it's too late." Maria blinked as if trying to process the words, as if the reality of what Greg was saying hadn't fully sunk in yet. Her face turned pale, and she shook her head slightly, her eyes not meeting Greg's. No, that's not possible." "Tommy? My son?" Greg nodded, the weight of the situation crushing him. "I know, Maria. I couldn't believe it either when he told me. But it's true. He's been lying, hiding this from us. He didn't think we'd find out, but now we know. It's all out in the open." Maria sat down heavily in one of the chairs at the kitchen table, her hands clutching the sides. Her mind was racing, processing the shock, the betrayal, the weight of her son's actions. But why? Why would he do this? He knows how much we've always been there for him. Greg leaned against the counter, his own frustration bubbling up. "I don't know, Maria. I don't know why he did it. He said he didn't mean for it to go this far. He said he didn't know how to stop it once it started. But the truth is, he didn't come to us. He didn't tell us when he should have. He kept this secret, and now it's a mess." Tears began to well up in Maria's eyes as the weight of it all hit her. "I just can't believe it. After everything we've done for him, after how hard we've worked to make this family work, how could he do this?" Greg didn't have an answer. He felt the same disbelief, the same hurt. The family they had worked so hard to build, the relationship they had all shared, felt like it was crumbling in front of them. How had it gone so wrong? He wanted to protect Maria from this pain, but it was already too late. The truth had come to light, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. You need to talk to him, Maria, Greg said softly. He's waiting for you. He's been in his room all evening, he doesn't know what to do either. I can't fix this for him. You're his mom. He needs you now more than ever. Maria wiped away a tear, standing up slowly. I don't even know where to start, Greg. I don't know how to look him in the eye after this. After what he's done. Greg reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. We're going to get through this. Together. I don't know how, but we have to. Maria nodded, her expression filled with uncertainty. She took a deep breath and walked toward the stairs. Greg stood there, his mind spinning, his heart heavy with what was about to happen. This wasn't just a family issue, it was a breakdown of trust, of values, of everything they had built together. It wasn't just Tommy who had to make things right. It was all of them. This was going to change everything. Greg sat down on the couch, his hands pressed into his forehead as he thought about what was next. Maria and Tommy would have their conversation, and that would likely be just the beginning of a long road to understanding and forgiveness, if that was even possible. Greg knew they couldn't simply sweep this under the rug. Tommy's actions had far-reaching consequences, not just for him but for the entire family. What hurt the most, however, was the feeling of betrayal, not just by Tommy, but by the secrecy, the lies, the manipulation. Greg had always prided himself on being the kind of father figure who could be trusted, who could guide his stepson through life's ups and downs. But now, it felt as if the foundation had been shattered. Could they rebuild that trust? Could things ever go back to the way they were? The more Greg thought about it, the more uncertain he became. There were too many unanswered questions, too many layers of pain to untangle. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He needed to understand why Tommy had done this, why he had lied, and why he hadn't come to them sooner. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted Greg's thoughts. Maria had come back down, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She didn't say anything at first, she just stood there, looking at Greg with a mixture of confusion and grief. He's sorry, Maria said quietly. He really is, Greg. But I don't know how to forgive him. Not yet. Greg nodded slowly. I don't know if I can either. Not yet. But we'll figure it out. Together. Maria sat down next to him, her hand resting in his. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in their thoughts. The house, which had once felt like a warm and safe place, now seemed cold and distant. Everything had changed. But maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when they would begin to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but they had to start somewhere. Greg? Maria's voice broke the silence. Yeah. I don't know how to fix this. But I'll try. For Tommy. For us. Greg squeezed her hand. We'll try, Maria. We'll try. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty, as the fallout from Tommy's actions seeped into every corner of their home. The quiet was deafening, the air thick with unsaid words. Greg and Maria spent most of their time separately, each lost in their thoughts, unable to find the right words to make sense of the chaos their family had suddenly become. Tommy stayed in his room, avoiding contact, while Maria tried her best to navigate through her own turmoil. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, like a fragile shell waiting to crack open. Greg spent his days replaying the conversation with Tommy, wishing he had said something different, something that would have prevented this. But the truth was, he didn't know what to say. How do you console your stepson after a betrayal so deep, so raw? How do you reach him when the very foundation of trust has been shattered? And then there was Maria, her hurt written all over her face, but she still tried to hold on to the hope that they could somehow salvage their family. She had her doubts, but she was willing to fight for it, for the sake of their son, even if it meant facing a painful reality. It was late one evening when the next twist came, one that no one saw coming. Tommy, who had kept to his room for the past few days, finally emerged. His face was pale, his eyes swollen from days of no sleep, but there was something different in his posture. He wasn't the same boy who had sat across from them just days ago, confessing his mistakes. No, this time, there was a resolve in him that Greg hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet determination. "Mom, Dad," Tommy said, his voice steady but low. He stood at the doorway of the living room, his hands in his pockets, almost as if he was bracing for impact. "I need to talk." Maria looked up from the couch, her eyes meeting his with a mix of disbelief and caution. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping for some sign of remorse, some explanation that would help her understand why Tommy had done what he did. But at the same time, she was scared. Scared of what he would say. Scared that whatever came next might be the final nail in the coffin of their already fractured family. Greg looked at Tommy with equal parts concern and confusion. He had expected this conversation to happen sooner, but there was something different about the way Tommy was approaching it. The air felt charged with anticipation, but also with the weight of what was to come. "I know you guys are probably mad at me," Tommy began, his voice soft but clear. "And you have every right to be. I messed up. I lied to you, I kept things from you, but I need you to understand something. It wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't just about Emily. It's more than that. There's something I need to tell you." Maria's heart sank. She had been bracing for an apology, for an explanation that would somehow make sense of everything. But now, as Tommy spoke, she felt a sense of dread creeping in. What could be worse than what they already knew? Greg exchanged a glance with Maria, his own instincts telling him to prepare for something they weren't expecting. "What is it, Tommy?" Greg asked, his voice firm but filled with a sense of urgency. Tommy looked down at the floor for a moment, as if trying to gather the strength to continue. "I didn't tell you the whole truth before," he said slowly. "About the affair. Emily wasn't the only one. There was someone else." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected there was more to the story, but hearing it out loud, from Tommy's lips, was like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy exhaled sharply, as if the weight of his confession was suffocating him. "I got involved with someone else, another girl. Someone I work with. It started off innocent, just talking, but then it turned into something else. Something I didn't know how to get out of." Greg felt his stomach drop. This was worse than he had imagined. Not only had Tommy been lying, but there was a second affair, a deeper betrayal that he hadn't even known about. How could this be happening? How had Tommy become someone so different from the person they had raised? The feelings of confusion, betrayal, and anger churned inside him like a storm, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Maria, her face pale, stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of hurt and disbelief. "Why keep it from us? Why keep lying to us?" Tommy looked down, guilt written all over his face. "I didn't know how to face you both. I didn't know how to explain it. I was ashamed. I didn't want to disappoint you, but now I realize I've already done that. I don't know how to make it right." Greg's mind was racing. His thoughts were a blur of anger, hurt, and confusion, but beneath it all was a sense of profound sadness. What had happened to their son? The boy they had raised to value honesty, integrity, and trust had turned into someone almost unrecognizable. Greg had always believed in the strength of their family, the foundation they had built over the years, but now, it felt like everything was crumbling beneath his feet. Maria's voice trembled as she spoke again. "Tommy. I don't know what to say. This is too much. How do we even begin to fix this? How do we rebuild trust when it feels like you've taken it all away?" Tommy's eyes were full of regret, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I just wanted you to know the truth. The whole truth." The room fell silent, the weight of Tommy's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. It was clear that there was no easy fix for what had happened, no quick resolution to the mess Tommy had created. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and painful decisions. But one thing was certain, they couldn't go back to the way things were. Not anymore. Greg looked at Maria, his heart breaking for her, for their family. He didn't know where to start or how to heal the wounds Tommy had caused, but he knew they couldn't give up. Not yet. They would have to face the truth, together, and try to rebuild, no matter how painful that process might be. "Tommy," Greg said after a long pause, his voice softer than before, "we're not going to pretend this didn't happen. But we're also not going to give up on you. We'll figure this out. But it's going to take time. And it's going to be hard." Maria nodded, her eyes still filled with tears, but there was a flicker of something else in her expression, maybe hope, maybe a quiet determination to heal. "We'll get through this, Tommy. But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take action. It's going to take showing us that you're willing to do the work." Tommy nodded, his face full of sorrow but also a glimmer of understanding. "I know, Mom. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll make it right." As they stood there in the aftermath of Tommy's confession, Greg felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over them. This wasn't just about a mistake or a betrayal, it was about rebuilding their family, piece by piece, and learning to trust again. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in days, Greg felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. Maybe there was still a chance for redemption. But the road ahead would be long, and no one could say how it would end. The days that followed Tommy's confession were heavy with uncertainty. There was no blueprint for healing, no clear guidebook for how to restore what had been broken. Greg and Maria were forced to navigate through unfamiliar terrain, a place where their family felt unfamiliar, and the trust they once had seemed like a distant memory. Tommy, though trying to rebuild the bridge he had burned, was not the same person he once was, nor were Greg and Maria the parents they had been. Their relationship was now defined by a silence that spoke louder than words, a silence that cut deep, but also held a strange, unspoken understanding. Maria kept herself busy, doing what she could to maintain a sense of normalcy in the household. She cooked, cleaned, and tried to be the strong matriarch she had always been, but behind the mundane tasks, her heart was unraveling. She no longer felt secure in her role as a mother and wife, her sense of identity shaken by the weight of the betrayal. Every time she looked at Tommy, the wound reopened, and her heart would break all over again. Yet, she also felt the instinct to protect him, as any mother would, even though her instincts screamed for her to step back, to let him feel the full force of his actions. Greg, on the other hand, had been distant. His mind often wandered to a dark place, one filled with anger and disappointment. The trust he had placed in Tommy, in the bond they had forged over the years, seemed so fragile now. He had always prided himself on being a good father, but how could he have missed the signs? How could he have been so blind to what was happening under his roof? The guilt gnawed at him every day, and it was starting to erode the sense of self-worth he had carried for so long. He found it difficult to look at Tommy without seeing the betrayal, the lies, the secrets. The first real breakthrough came one evening, after dinner. It was an unusually quiet night, the weight of the past few days hanging in the air. Tommy had been attempting to spend more time with his family, but the tension between them made it feel impossible to connect. That night, however, there was a change in him, a shift that had been slowly building, almost imperceptibly, in the days since his confession. He wasn't the same boy who had walked in, broken and regretful. He seemed different. More mature, as if the burden of the truth had forced him to see life through a new lens. Tommy sat across from Greg and Maria at the dinner table, his shoulders slumped but his eyes steady. He hadn't said much all evening, but there was something in the air, something unspoken that made this moment feel different. Maria noticed it first, the way he was looking at her. It wasn't the way he had looked at her before, as if she were just a mom who provided comfort and discipline. This time, there was an earnestness in his eyes, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "Mom, Dad," Tommy began, his voice steady, though it trembled slightly, betraying his nervousness. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I know I've hurt you both. I can't take that back. But I want you to know that I'm not the same person I was when I first told you. I'm trying to do better." Maria held her breath as she listened, her heart torn between her desire for him to truly change and the raw pain she still felt. "What do you mean, Tommy?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Tommy looked down for a moment, then met her gaze with a sense of vulnerability she hadn't seen in him before. "I've been going to therapy. I'm trying to understand why I made those choices, why I did what I did. And I'm starting to realize that a lot of it wasn't just about Emily or the other girl. It was about me. I've been lost for a long time, and I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to deal with the pressure I've been feeling, at school, at work, with everything. I've been pushing everyone away, including you, because I didn't know how to handle it. I've been running from my problems instead of facing them." Greg and Maria exchanged a glance. Tommy's words were unexpected, and for the first time, they seemed to come from a place of genuine self-reflection. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just raw honesty. And for the first time in weeks, Maria felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way forward, after all. "I didn't realize how much I've hurt you both," Tommy continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought if I kept everything hidden, kept living my life the way I wanted to, it would just go away. But it didn't. I see that now. I've been selfish. I've been disrespectful. And I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I want to make things right." Maria felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't just from the pain of the past, it was also from something else. Relief. Perhaps, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. Her son, who had seemed so distant and lost, was showing signs of understanding, of growth. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it felt like a beginning. Greg, too, was moved by Tommy's words. It wasn't just the apology that mattered, it was the acknowledgement of the deep-rooted issues Tommy had been facing, issues that had been invisible to them until now. Greg felt a weight lift off his chest, not because the problem was solved, but because Tommy was finally taking responsibility for his actions. It was the first step toward healing. "I'm proud of you, Tommy," Greg said, his voice surprisingly steady, considering the emotional whirlwind he had been caught in. "This isn't easy for any of us, but you're taking the right steps. We're not going to pretend everything's okay right away, but this is progress. We'll work through this together." Maria nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "We'll get through this," she said softly. "But it's going to take time. We can't rush it." Tommy nodded, his face serious, but there was a spark in his eyes, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. "I know. I'm willing to put in the work." And so, they began again, slowly, cautiously. They didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was uncertain, but they had taken the first step toward healing. It wasn't just about forgiving Tommy or forgetting the past, it was about rebuilding the trust that had been shattered, brick by brick. It would take time, effort, and a lot of painful conversations, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Maria and Greg were cautiously optimistic. Maybe, just maybe, their family could heal. In the weeks that followed, things didn't magically return to normal. Trust wasn't restored overnight, and the emotional scars were still there. But Tommy kept going to therapy, and slowly, with each session, he began to unravel the layers of his past behavior. Greg and Maria, too, sought counseling, trying to learn how to support their son while also healing from the wounds he had inflicted. It wasn't easy, but little by little, they began to rediscover their connection to each other. The community, too, took notice. People who had known Tommy, Greg, and Maria for years saw the change. The gossip that once swirled around their family began to fade as Tommy proved that he was taking responsibility for his actions. Greg and Maria, once the subject of whispered conversations, began to regain their sense of pride in the way they were handling the situation. They were no longer seen as victims of Tommy's betrayal, but as a family working to rebuild, brick by brick. Tommy's journey wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments where he questioned whether he was worthy of his parents' forgiveness, but he pressed on. He wanted to prove that he could be better, that he could make up for the pain he had caused. It was a long road, but over time, the distance between him and his family began to close. The healing wasn't just about the broken relationship between parent and child, it was about rebuilding a family, a community, and a life that had been forever changed by betrayal. But with each passing day, Tommy, Greg, and Maria began to understand that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and moving forward together.